Hello, friends. Welcome to week 3 of this class. I'm in my office today because my coworkers are not in here to be bothered by me recording, so sorry for the chaos. There's quite a few of us sharing a very small room, which is cool. It's where the magic happens, right? So this week we are going to talk about racial, ethnic, and religious diversity in education. So without further ado, let's roll. So obviously in the first week we talked about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and you watched that documentary on Teach Us All and realized that the road to a desegregated school was one that was fraught with many challenges, especially for students who wanted to integrate into these schools. Now, while segregation in school is illegal now, you will find that it's not quite that simple. So according to Title VI, which was a law that was passed, no person in the United States shall on the ground of race, color, or national origin be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of or be subject to discrimination under any program or actively receiving federal financial assistance. And basically what that means is that if a school wants to receive its financial assistance from the government, it can't basically break those rules and exclude people based on race, color, or national origin. Okay, which seems pretty straightforward. So schools are required to follow those Title VI rules. Title VI has expanded to protect religion in particular circumstances where the First Amendment isn't as applicable. Not that the First Amendment is ever not applicable, but it's kind of provided extra protections in situations where it might not necessarily be freedom of religion, but more like protecting you from other people discriminating against you based on your religion. So those are all kind of key things that you just need to have in the back of your head as we head into this unit together. So part one of this, we're going to look at racial and ethnic diversity as well as a little bit of socioeconomic status. That'll come up again later. And what we're particularly going to look at is, unfortunately, not all schools are equal. And nowhere is that truer than in Southern Illinois, although that's a pattern that you'll find across the world. I coach a speech team, right? And what's interesting about speech is, unlike basketball, you compete against schools of all sizes. So my students have to compete against schools. Like when we go to, if we were to go to state, for example, we are against the largest, fanciest, wealthiest schools of suburban Chicago, despite the fact that we are from Vienna, Illinois. And what's interesting about this, and we don't compete in Chicago during the regular season, but we do have to go all the way up to the Metro East area, right? Which is the Illinois metro area that's outside of St. Louis. And it's so interesting to take my students there because they see all the things that these other schools have. And a lot of times it's the first time they've noticed, wait a minute, why don't we have an entire dark room for photography or a podcasting lab that's not randomly thrown in a closet? To which I remind them, you're lucky you have a podcasting lab. Most schools around here don't. So a lot of schools around here are not equal, and we're going to kind of look into that today. So just as a review, if you were physically here with me, I'd ask you, what's the difference between race and ethnicity? But since you're not, I'm just going to have to tell you. Race is kind of the biological makeup that we assign to people, whereas ethnicity is more based on your origin, culture, and heritage, which is why it is perfectly possible for you to be of Latino and Latina origin, but also be Black or white or whatever. Moving along. So why this matters, even though schools have been desegregated for years, in theory, the problem still exists that students that are at predominantly minority and impoverished schools don't receive the same quality education that schools in wealthy areas receive. And whether we really like to admit it or not, schools are still segregated in their own way. You'll actually look at that for a discussion board for this week, but I don't want to spoil the surprise before you get there. It's not a good surprise, but anywho, sorry, let me refocus here. So when we're talking about school segregation, how is segregation now legal? Sorry, the heater overblows in here and I'm literally dying right now. When we're talking about how segregation in school is still legal, despite the fact that we have passed Brown versus Board of Education, the issue is that you have to remember that certain people have been systemically denied the same opportunities in America, right? So if you are looking at a group of people who were oppressed and not given the same level of career opportunities as, white people would have been, they haven't had the same time to build up that generational wealth. And oftentimes they've been relegated to neighborhoods where there is lower for, a more affordable housing because of that. So in a way, what happens whenever you really see suburbia, they called it white flight at the time. And it was the idea that whenever segregation was no longer legal, wealthy, affluent white people would move into communities and make sure that all the houses in the community were so unaffordable that nobody else but other wealthy white people would live there. And because school districts are based on your geographic location, in a way, you still have schools that end up segregated, even though segregation isn't necessarily legal. And that, of course, is challenging all on its own. But one area that you particularly see this, especially if you're from Southern Illinois, which I'm assuming most of you are since you're in a Shawnee College class, but your socioeconomic status impacts this as well, right? Schools are primarily funded based on property taxes. We talked a little bit about this in a previous lesson, I think, or maybe I taught it in Education 110. But anywho, most of your school funding comes from property taxes. So if you live in an area that's super rich, cool, you've got lots of money rolling in. And if you live in an area that's not super wealthy, like if primarily like public housing, for example, you don't pay property taxes if you rent. So if your area is primarily based on public housing, that's not a lot of property taxes coming in. Or in our situation in Southern Illinois, if your area is primarily populated by cows and trees and corn and soybeans, you're also not necessarily collecting a ton of property tax revenue. So in 1991, there was this guy named Jonathan Kozol, and you can see his picture of him there, who published this book called Savage Inequalities. There was a documentary made about it in 1996, and I actually think I have it saved in like the slides that I now have hidden from here. I remember watching it when I was a senior in high school, and it was why I became a teacher, because I went, what the heck? This is not okay. I'm going to work to make that better. Have I fixed it? Of course not. I'm one person, but I'm trying my best, right? And this documentary gave us a visual representation of just how unequal schools were. And of course, that was in 1996. Most of you probably weren't born yet, unless you're my age, in which case, we're living our best 30s life here. So surely you would think that things would get better. But have they? So in 2016, there was an article published called The Inequalities Are Still Savage. We have another one from 2019 here, and you can skim through these if you'd like to. But you'll find that in a lot of cases, schools are not still as equal as they should be. Illinois passed the evidence-based funding model to try and make that better, which is basically where the state supplements the amount of revenue that they provide for you based on like, okay, if you're not drawing as much in property taxes, here is the number that it takes to educate a child in your region. We will supplement you with more income. Okay, cool. Except it's only 70% funded. The state doesn't always pay for what's called mandated categoricals, which are like the things you have to pay for, like free lunches and transportation. And they don't fully anticipate EBF to be funded until sometime in the 2030s. And that's been pushed off quite a few times already, right? So we run into this issue of, I'm sorry, the lights look really, really bright in there. I'm trying to make this a little less awkward for you guys, but it's me, so of course it's awkward. So anyway, even though we want things to have gotten better, they really haven't in a way that we would like to have seen in education. So as always, I can't show videos, record myself teaching and everything at the same time. Otherwise, the internet shuts down because Southern Illinois. But I do want you to go through and watch these videos. Okay. They are both very, very short. You'll find that whenever you click on this one, it is a TikTok video. So it's not very long. Okay. This is a school that's in Indiana, and I can't remember the name of the actual school off the top of my head right now, but they say it at the beginning of the video. So you should be good there. I just remember it's in Indiana. I want you to look at it and determine how much does it look like the school you attended when you went to school, or if you're a dual credit kid, if you're still in school. And then I want you to take a look at this video, which is a brief news report from Detroit, and see how much this school looks like yours. Okay. So if you need to pause and watch those real quick, you can. Or if you want to go and watch them after the lecture, you're totally fine to do that, but you will need to watch them because you do have to reference them in your discussion board post for this week. And I think you will find it illuminating how very different these two schools look, despite the fact that they both serve students in America. The one down here is technically optional, but if you're just interested in how that was a horrible drawing, if you're just interested in how Detroit got into that situation, that's some more details on it. You don't necessarily have to watch that one, but you for sure have to watch the TikTok. That's such a weird thing to say as a teacher, and the news report here. And when you watch them, you will understand why I want you to see how different schools look across the state. Now, what I have here is just a collection of images that kind of show this microcosm of how not all schools are created equal in such an interesting way that we can probably all relate to school lunch. Okay. I went to speech nationals over the summer, and we went to a school that had the school that we were competing at was in Des Moines, Iowa. It was in one of the burbs outside of it. And it had a full service salad bar and a variety of different lunch options every single day, and a fresh fruit bar where you could grab your fresh fruit. And there's some schools that have things that look like that. Like we've got this nice breakfast plate here with a full fresh cantaloupe and a Belgian waffle and some nice protein from your scrambled eggs. We have this nice taco bar going up here. I don't want to name names because this one's local, but this is a school that I have been to previously. And that was, yes, a slice of melted American cheese on top of a sausage patty. And that was served for lunch one day, right? Which honestly, I can't even complain about because it's a heck ton better than whatever this bad boy is over here, right? So if we're not even equal in the terms of what we serve to kids for what they eat for lunch, and you've got to remember that for a whole lot of kids, the free lunch that they receive might be the only solid meals that they are getting per day. And some kids are getting this, while other kids are getting this. And what's more unequal about this is often the kids that are getting this are the ones that probably are really relying on this for their primary source of nutrition, right? So we've got problems with how schools are funded. In addition to that, we also have really dramatic gaps in performance based on racial biases that kind of happen, right? So if you take a look at this, this is a list, and this is from 2022, but the data still holds. I just haven't found a prettier infographic that fits nicely on my screen yet. But when I show you how to look at the Illinois school report card data, you will find nothing's changed. But basically, in our Illinois test results, there is a huge difference between number of students who meet or exceeded expectations. And this is on the IAR test, which is what elementary schools take, the Illinois Assessment of Readiness. So if you look overall in the state of Illinois, we've got about 30% of kids who were meeting or exceeding expectations in English language arts, and 25.8% that were meeting or exceeding in math. And this is elementary students. But when you take data, you can do something called disaggregation. That's spelled disaggregration. Okay. And disaggregating data basically means breaking it down by subgroups and looking to see what story the data is actually telling. So if you look, you'll see that for the Asian American cohort, you have 58.6 of them who are meeting or exceeding on state standards in ELA, English Language Arts, and 60.2% that are meeting or exceeding in math. Now, when you take those same group of elementary students, but you only look at the African American population, you have 12.1% that are meeting or exceeding in English and only 6.8% that are meeting or exceeding in math. The numbers are slightly better for the Hispanic and Latino cohort, but not much better. For your multiracial, again, it gets a little bit better. And then for white students, it improves. Basically, that is second, to your Asian American cohort. Likewise, we see these same disparities in socioeconomic background too. And when we're talking about that, we're talking often about poverty levels, right? So for low income students, of those 29.9% that were succeeding in ELA, only 15.9% of our low income students are making it. For children with disabilities, the number's dropping down to 12.9%. And of course, it's holding similar over there in math as well. For English language learners, or for students who may be learning English as a second language or have other languages spoken at home, only 6.9% are making it in ELA and only 6.8% are making it in math. For students with IEPs, which we talked about last week, 7%, right? So this is a very dramatic gap, right? And it is not acceptable in 2025 that we are still leaving this many children behind. And lest you think this is only in the grade school element of things, this is a problem that's persisted high school as well. So the SAT is what we were giving in 2022. We have since in Illinois transitioned back to the ACT. And again, you'll notice your Asian American cohort is killing it, right? 60 and 66% of them succeeding in ELA and math. And then those numbers dropping dramatically from there. In high school, the numbers get even worse for your English language learners. Notice that only 1% of them met in reading and only 2.4% met in math. So this is a problem, right? Because we are educating kids, but we're not educating them equally. And at the same time, if we zoom out entirely and, look at the data before we disaggregate it, these are kind of low numbers to be making it statewide too, which part of that was potential issues with using the SAT as a testing metric, which is why we've since switched back to the ACT. But nevertheless, it's concerning, right? Because if you have a kid, you don't want there to be a 70% chance that they're not ready to succeed in reading, which is what the data in Illinois currently indicates. So, where all this came from was the Illinois State Report Card. Um, this will be an assignment that we do, but it is complicated enough that I'm going to have a separate video for it. So, I'm going to teach you how to use the Illinois State Report Card and how to do this assignment in a separate video. It's too much to get with just this one. Okay. So, we will come back to this. Cross my heart, I promise. All right, moving along, we're going to look at religion or religious pluralism in a secular classroom, which basically translates to in public schools, you are not allowed to pick a particular religion to favor. There you go. You have to be accepting of all children's religions. So what's really key here is making sure, are we making sure our classrooms feel welcoming of all people, people of all religious backgrounds, including those who might have no religious background, right? And this can be like as simple as, okay, if I put up only a Christmas tree, but 50% of my students are Jewish, perhaps I need to consider adding a menorah to my list as well. That's the candle that you have for Hanukkah, right? So it's considering who is in my classroom and how do I make sure that everyone feels welcome. Students, of course, have their own legal rights to religious freedom that have to be respected as well. For example, you cannot confiscate a kid's religious material from them and be like, you are not allowed to read that in my class. I mean, it's one thing if you're like, you're not allowed to be off track while I'm teaching, like that would be a different scenario. But if you were particularly picking on a specific subgroup of people and only taking their Bibles or their Qurans or their Torahs or whatever, that's a problem, right? So you can't do that. So for your discussion, okay, yes, for your discussion board this week, sorry, because there's a variety of things that we're looking at this week. And sorry, this is just kind of a longer unit. Actually, I think this one doesn't show up until next week. Anyway, at one point you will have a discussion board that requires you to look at these two articles. And I should have written that down before I started teaching the lesson, but we're already 15 minutes in, so we're going to keep going. But anyway, this particularly looks at students' rights with regards to religion in school. So you will take a look at two of these and they'll relate to a discussion board that you will do. It's either this week or next week. I really feel like it's next week though. In your reflection notebook, you're going to think about your own religious background or lack thereof, and I am not here to judge you regardless of what it is that you do pick, but I want you to consider what's one way that might influence how you respond to students' religious practices or beliefs in your own classroom. Could be positive, could be negative, could be complicated. I'm not grading you looking for a right answer here because, guys, life is complicated and overcoming our biases can be a challenge, right? So I want you to consider, okay, what is my current religious or lack thereof background? And how would that impact me if I have a student who is on the complete opposite side of the spectrum as me? How will I make sure they feel welcome? Okay, just things to consider. Like I said, there's not a right answer. I mean, if you put like, no, I'm going to disrespect a student no matter what, like that's a wrong answer. But I'm not looking for something specific. You can talk, like you can grapple with the fact that it might be a little complicated to deal with. I'm okay with that. Last but not least, we're going to talk about diverse classrooms because even if you are, like, for example, I teach at Vienna, right? And let's be real, Vienna is a predominantly white school. But even with that, there is still diversity within my classrooms, right? Even if I have a class where literally every kid is white, like my 5th hour class, for example, right? There's still diversity that is happening in there, okay? Whether it is diversity of religion or lack thereof, whether it's diversity of political thought, whether it's diversity of socioeconomic status. And what I want you to consider whenever you're designing your future classrooms is how do you make sure that every student feels seen? Like imagine for a moment if you turned on Netflix for some nice quality binge watching, maybe it's a snow day and you've got some hot chocolate in your hand, but there's not a single show on there with a single character that looks like you. And you probably don't think too much about it because, especially if you are white, probably most people do look like you on Netflix. But if no one has any cultural similarities to you, that causes kids often to feel kind of alienated. So it's really, really key whenever you are going through, especially if you were teaching like an elementary classroom where you would have a classroom library or an English language arts room, to make sure that you have a variety of things that show all students, right? So I taught high school English, so I haven't ever been on the grade school side of things. But when I taught high school English, one of the most important things I always believed in was having a library in my classroom. And one thing that I always tried to do was make sure that I had books about a variety of children. Right. So I had When Dimple Met Rishi by Miss Menon, which was a book about two students who were like, Indian American immigrants or descendants of Indian American immigrants. Right. Didn't have any in my classroom per se, because at that time I taught at Pope County and that was also not very racially diverse. But I want my kids to know that there's a whole world of people out there. Right. And in the event that somebody would transfer in, that might relate more to that, I would want to make sure that that was in there for them as well. So there's a real quick TED Talk for you to check out here if you have some time. This one's not connected to a discussion board, but I do highly recommend just skimming through it. That really focuses on the importance of why kids need diverse literature. And like I said, I know this won't impact some of you, right? Like if you're going to be a high school math teacher, you're probably not going to have a ton of work with literature in your realm. But I know a whole lot of you are going to be elementary teachers, and you all will have little classroom libraries. So make sure that you consider, does my classroom library reflect all of the students who are in here and the future people that my students are going to have to grow up and live amongst, right? Because we want to foster that empathy early. And that whole basis was really built on the work of Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, who wrote this essay called Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors. You can read the essay here, but basically the gist of the metaphor is that literature serves as a way for students to learn about people who are different from them. It can be a mirror, right? And the idea of a mirror is that you would see yourself in it. So books that are about other people who are of my socioeconomic status and background are going to feel familiar to me, but they can also be a window. You can see through a window. So while I might be reading, like for example, I read Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds, which talked about gun violence in the African-American urban community. Not a reality I've ever lived, right? But it was a window for me because it gave me insight into that world. Or it can be what's called a sliding glass door, which is the idea is you can walk through and culturally experience something that you wouldn't normally experience. I read a fantastic book at the beginning of this year that was actually nonfiction called There's No Place for Us, or There's No Home for Us. I'm blanking on the name of it now. And it was on working class homeless people in America. And that was an element, that's a life that I have never experienced, fortunately, nor do I necessarily know anybody in that scenario, like in the adult world. So, for me, it was a way to look and see like, oh, here's what's going on in the Atlanta, Georgia housing crisis. I'm not from Atlanta, Georgia. I don't know a ton about it, right? But I've been there enough to kind of recognize some of the landmarks that were mentioned and realize, oh, I never realized that the impact the 1996 Olympics had on, affordable housing in Atlanta. So in a way, it served as a glass door for me to open that in and see into that world and, experience it in a way where I wouldn't have normally known anything about that. And this is Dr. Bishop herself, so you can kind of see her talk about her thing if you'd rather hear her than read her essay. I'm going to skip past that. Otherwise, my computer will die. Oh, goodness. Anyway, so breaking down the metaphor round two, since I kind of explained it already. So consider like, who's your personal hero? Do they look like you? That's typically the case, and it's totally normal. Like when I think of my personal hero, I think of my grandpa. Does he look like me? I mean, yeah, I'm biologically related to him, right? But why, that's normal. But why is it important to see characters who look like us? Because it helps affirm the idea that we can be anything, right? Why is it important to see through the lives of others who don't look like us? Because there's a whole wide world out there and we need to be able to empathize with other people. And why is that empathy beneficial? Because it makes us better freaking people, right? Like at the end of the day, the ability to empathize with someone, more of us need it. Just go to Facebook if you don't believe me. Last but not least, and I promise this is the last slide. I know this is a long unit. We're going to talk about English language learners or EL students. I actually need to update this because we have since changed it. Like it started as ESL. So if you've heard of ESL, those were English as a second language. We renamed it to English language learners because a lot of students would be like ESL students, but perhaps they had more than one language. Like I had an EL student who was an exchange student from Italy one year. English was not her second language. It was her fourth. She could speak Italian, French, German, English, and since then she's taught herself South Korean. She's a remarkable child. I mean, she's an adult now, but nevertheless. So then they changed it to English language learners. And then since then they just dropped that to one EL. Okay. So like I said, it's just kind of to reflect the idea that kids are multilingual. And there's a lot of things that fall into this category, right? Like there are students who technically qualify for EL status that you might not recognize because they speak English perfectly, right? So this includes English language students who have perhaps spoken English since birth, but because another language is spoken in their home, there might be a few extra supports that they need to be successful. And there might also be extra supports their parents need to be successful, right? You might teach elementary school and you might have a child who speaks perfectly good English and then their parents don't speak English at all. So in that scenario, that is a great time to use technology that's available at your disposal. And as much as I'm very meh about AI, that's a good time to go to your AI buddy and go, hey, translate my newspaper into Spanish. That way, all of your parents can be engaged in your classroom work. right? So good thing is, like, EL students often have a lot of strengths. Often they have a better understanding of grammar than your traditional, like, only English students do. And if you've ever taken a foreign language, you probably noticed that you think a whole lot more about grammar when you've learned a foreign language. Because of the way we learn language, grammar rules get kind of programmed into our brain, right? Literally without us thinking about it. It's the reason people around here constantly say, "Oh, I seen that," even though it's not grammatically correct, because they've heard it so many times. Okay. But whenever you are an English language learner, you often have a stronger understanding of grammar because you have to apply it as you're doing translation. They often have a curiosity and a willingness to take risks and a unique perspective from different cultural backgrounds. However, they also particularly have challenges as well. Sometimes there are students, because they are English learners, who are put in an EL classroom specifically, not usually around here as much, because we don't have often as many EL students, unless you are in like the Cobden or the oh my gosh, Unity Point. Sorry, I couldn't think of that place in Jackson County. Unless you're in one of those communities where they just have higher populations of English language students. A lot of times we don't necessarily have ESL classrooms, even though we might need those around here. But separation from the mainstream also means they get less chances to hear English. Like we have one EL student who has an ESL specific class. That's one less period of the day that he's in with the rest of the mainstream classes, as we call them. Culture shock, time restraints, and of course, communication with families is the biggest. Ignore this thing that says your assignment. I forgot to delete that off of there, but I have since cut that assignment out of the curriculum and worked it into an anchor project instead. So that's not there. Just pretend like you don't see it. So if you want to start looking at anchor, this is anchor project number 2. I'm so sorry that this is mislabeled. I need to fix this as well. You are clear to start working on that. But the main thing that I recommend you doing is that we need to go back and we need to talk about the Illinois School Report Card. So if you want to head on and watch that video the next time you have time and a moment to sit down with your computer, that will be your next step. Sorry for the random things mislabeled in this slideshow. Clearly, I need to update those. And unfortunately, I don't really have great video editing software, so you get this live as if you were sitting with me. So without further ado, I'm going to let you go, and I'll see you back whenever we talk about looking at the Illinois School Report Card data.